Good morning and happy Friday, everyone. Welcome to E-Rate Form 470 for Category 2. This is the funding year 2025 version. My name is Lauren Abner. I'm the State E-Rate Coordinator for Kentucky Public Libraries, and I'm here to provide consultation and one-on-one filing support to any Kentucky library that wants to participate in the E-Rate program. So we do have some link sections in the slides if you're looking at the PDF copy, so you can jump directly to the section of the slides that contains the information that's most relevant to you. I do want to point out in the filing the Form 470 section, there are subsections for various parts of the form, and the example service request section is color-coded. That way it's easier to follow along with each particular example, which will appear in a different color. Before we get into all this beautiful content, I do have to give my usual disclaimer. I do my level best to give you the most accurate, up-to-date information at the time of this presentation, but I am not the FCC, which governs the E-Rate program, and I am not USAC, the Universal Service Administrative Company, which is the daily administrator, which creates the forms that you fill out and they process them. So things could change after the recording of this presentation, but if you hear something that contradicts what I said and it's from the FCC or USAC, you should go by what they say, because they are the authorities on this program, and I really am not, as much as I would like to be. Okay, so let's take a step back and talk about where we are in this whole E-Rate process. So I've updated the E-Rate funding years chart to include the deadlines for funding year 2025. If you look at the yellow row for funding year 2025, we're in the competitive bidding time period. And we now know that the last date to file a Form 470 and make sure you get all of the steps of the process completed to file an application on time is February 26th, 2025. So last date to start a Form 470, keeping in mind that the closer you file February 26th, the more difficult you're making it to get in your bids, evaluate the bids, execute a contract if needed, and file the application form in window, which is the goal. So the Form 471 application is due on March 26th. So during this time period, we've got lots of people working on 470s and 471s. So today we're just focusing on the Form 470 specifically for Category 2. If you look in that yellow row, the dates for recurring services in the funding year start on July 1st, 2025 and run to June 30th, 2026. And that would be, say, monthly maintenance services or monthly managed services. When we're talking about of networking equipment under internal connections, the time period begins on April 1st, 2025 and runs through September 30th, 2026. So that's 3 months after the funding year ends. This next slide just kind of emphasizes again the time period that we're concerned with. I highlighted in yellow the dates for non-recurring services, meaning the purchase and installation of internal connections or networking equipment. So a lot of libraries will be going through the early purchase period, which begins on April 1st, 2025, and may continue making purchases and having equipment installed through September 30th, 2026. Now let's talk about all those eligible services that your library might need discounts on. So you can access the full E-Rate eligible services list on the USAC website. Make sure to grab the 2025 version. The eligible services list is split into two broad categories. Category 1 concerns getting connectivity to the building. So that's getting your internet access or some kind of wide area network or transport circuit to the building. And category 2 is about getting that connectivity to the devices within the building. So that would be computers on the network. It could be various devices owned by the library or by patrons that might be accessing the Wi-Fi. So very briefly, because we've covered category 1 competitive bidding in another webinar, basically category 1 is all the different ways that you can get on the internet. Most libraries are filing for fiber or cable connections for their various branch buildings. We have about 50 libraries that request cellular data for the bookmobile, and brand new for funding year 2025, we have hotspot lending for patrons. And again, that time period for those recurring services is July 1st, 2025 to June 30th, 2026. And with the exception of hotspot lending, there's not a particular budget for category 1. So as long as you're making a cost-effective decision for, say, the internet for your main building and the bookmobile hotspot, you'll get your discount on that full cost, whereas there are some caps in place for hotspot lending. And that's a contrast that we'll see with category 2, which does have an overall budget assigned for the entire category. And so category 2 is split into 3 service types. First up is internal connections. That is the most common request that Kentucky libraries make under category 2. So this involves the networking equipment, licensing, or cabling needed to get that connectivity throughout your building. So we've had libraries request discounts on a cabling project to take out old cabling and put in new cabling to support a faster speed, or do cabling in a new construction building. We've got switches, routers, access points, firewalls, battery backups and racks, also caching services, antennas, and the software needed to run the equipment. There are some provisos. I've got some asterisks indicating where some items may be partially eligible or ineligible based on how the device is being used, or the inclusion of advanced security features, which are not currently covered by the traditional E-rate program. Most commonly, we see that with firewalls. In general, the firewall hardware is 100% eligible for E-rate discounts, but the firewall license that gives you permission to use the device and also handles advanced security features like anti-malware, antivirus, anti-intrusion, or content filtering, that portion of the license is not E-rate eligible. You might see a license that's 50% eligible as an example. And we'll talk more about finding that particular information later. All right. Next up in category 2, we have basic maintenance of internal connections. So this would be repair and upkeep, software patches, configuration changes, basic technical support for the equipment that's eligible under internal connections. So often requests for basic maintenance cover manufacturer subscriptions for technical support and software patches. An example might be Cisco SmartNet for a firewall, and that's how you get the updated antivirus definitions and other security patches. And then last but certainly not least, we have managed internal broadband services, or MIBs, which is a growing portion of E-rate requests for Kentucky libraries. For managed services, you have a vendor that is setting up, managing, monitoring your networking equipment on a continuous basis to make sure that it's still functional. And if something goes wrong, they're responsible for addressing that. So it may be a situation where the library owns the networking equipment outright, and you're just paying for the service to have somebody manage it for you. Or it could be a situation where you are leasing equipment from the service provider, and the service provider actually owns the equipment. They're responsible for updating the licensing and everything like that. So we saw several libraries add that service in the past year, and I see that as a growth area for Kentucky libraries. And then under miscellaneous, some taxes and surcharges may be E-rate eligible. We tend not to see that as much on category 2 as far as taxes, rental or lease fees. So it's more economical for the library to rent or lease equipment rather than owning it outright. You can do that. Shipping to get equipment to your building. Training for new equipment. So if you're having some new equipment installed and the vendor can do 3 or 4 hours of training to let you know how to make those configuration changes, you can get training discounts only for new equipment. It can't be equipment previously purchased with E-rate or equipment purchased outside E-rate. And then, of course, installation and configuration, which can be performed by the vendor that is selling you the equipment, or can be handled by a third party doing the installation, even if they didn't sell you equipment. Important reminder for the E-rate eligible services list is that most of the things you request will entail compliance with the Children's Internet Protection Act, or CIPA. So if you're buying internet access under category 1, any kind of internet access, or if you're buying any service type under category 2, then you must comply with the Children's Internet Protection Act. There are 3 main elements to that. You need to have a technology protection measure or filter in place. You're filtering for certain visual images that are considered obscene, child pornography, or sexual material harmful to minors. You also must have an internet safety or use policy that addresses certain key elements of children's safe use of the internet when they're at the library. And at some point prior to putting that policy in place, you needed to have advertised and held a public hearing. This often occurs during a board meeting. Many libraries did this years ago in 2002, 2003 even, when CIPA originally went into effect. If you no longer have the documentation of that public hearing, you need to hold it again. I'm happy to answer questions on CIPA, but that is a whole topic that we have a webinar on an entire hour because it's a big deal for Kentucky libraries. And please feel free throughout to ask questions as they come up, and I'll be glad to address those. Now let's talk about category 2 budgets, because there is a limit on the amount of support libraries can get through the E-rate program. So first we need to talk about the discount rate. So the discount rate changes from year to year, and it's determined through a matrix that uses the percentage of students in the local school district who qualify for free or reduced lunch, and whether your library system is overall considered rural or urban. Now, the percentage of students eligible for what we call NSLP, that is handled by the local school district. They upload that information in their profiles, and your library system's main branch is linked to the local school system. So the data about the free and reduced lunch students is automatically pulled over to your profile so the system can determine your eligibility. Keeping in mind that right now, what you see on any application forms filed is tentative. The data is finalized during application review for the schools. So you put those 2 items together and you get this beautiful discount matrix. So the discount matrix, most libraries are falling into the top 2 brackets, meaning 80% or 90% for category 1. I do want to note that category 2 tops out at 85% discounts. It goes back to this idea that we want applicants to have more skin in the game, so they're not gold plating their networks and requesting things that they shouldn't. Wasn't my decision, but that's how it is. So today, covering category 2, if you're in the top discount bracket, then again, your discount will be 85%. 100%. And the majority of Kentucky libraries, like 3/4 of them, qualify for the top bracket. Okay, so let's talk Category 2 budgets. So the Category 2 budget is calculated over a 5-year period. We're currently in a period that runs from funding year 2021 to funding year 2025. And this amount indicates the pre-discount cost, the maximum pre-discount cost on which your discount can be applied. So to determine that budget number, we multiply the interior square footage of each branch by $4.50 per square foot. And if we have smaller branches that have less than 5,556 square feet, then they qualify for a budget floor of $25,000. So you calculate the budget per branch and then add it all together in one big pot that can be spent across your library system. So if you've got a big main branch that has a lot of square footage, that might make up for a smaller branch that doesn't have as much square footage but still needs some expensive networking equipment. We should be going into a new Category 2 budget year, starting with funding year 2026. And at that time, there should be an inflation adjustment to the amount. And also, I wanted to point out that any eligible instructional, what we call public service outlets, I should say, contribute to the budget. So that's your main branch, other branch buildings, your bookmobile. I know that seems weird for square footage, but it does. What can't be counted are buildings that are considered administrative or non-instructional. So that might be, a garage for the bookmobile where you don't have any public services. So if you're not sure about what counts, there is a convenient tool that does the math for you. So the E-Rate C2 budget tool, funding year 2021 plus, you can go to it and then filter the results by your library's build entity number, and it will pop up with your budget, taking into account the eligible square footage that can be counted toward the budget, and then any expenditures that have been approved during the relevant funding period. All right, so the administrative window for making profile changes for various entities has closed, but we can still make edits if needed. So for example, if you've got a branch under construction and need to add it to your system, if you need to update the square footage of a particular branch, those changes can be made during E-Rate application review. So it may be that based on documentation you'll submit to the application reviewer, you may have a higher budget than what the system currently says. So your Category 2 budget increases when you gain finished interior square footage, and that needs to be completed by the service delivery deadline for the funding year, in this case, September 30th of 2026. You want to have documentation such as a letter or email from the architect, or it may be pictures from the blueprints to verify what that square footage is going to be. Your Category 2 budget is reduced whenever a funding commitment is made. So for funding years 2021 to 2025, as you receive a funding commitment for discounts on a certain cost, the pre-discount cost of those services is subtracted from your budget. So it's based on the funding commitments. If you find a situation where there was a reason you didn't end up purchasing the networking equipment, or it was less expensive than you originally thought, you may be filing what's called a Form 500 to restore those unused pre-discount dollars to your Category 2 budget. And the Form 500 is pretty handy when it comes to Category 2. It's also a form that can be used to request additional time to install equipment if there's a delay beyond your vendor's control, such as just extended construction delays, which happen often. You can also adjust the contract expiration if you need that additional time to make those purchases and get the installation done. It can also be used to cancel or reduce the amount of funding on a particular request. So you can return or cancel unused funds, keeping in mind that once you do this, this is irrevocable. So you give it back and there are no, you can't undo that later. So you only want to do that when you're absolutely certain that the funds won't be used. And just some more details about the Form 500 can be found on the USAC website. Okay, so now we've got a little background on Category 2, what's eligible, and the amount of funding out there. Let's talk a bit about competitive bidding. This really is the most important step of the E-rate process, because if you goof it up, it's really going to impact your ability to get discounts on the application form. So competitive bidding starts with a Form 470, which is a standardized form to describe what your library might need in the upcoming funding year. So you're letting potential service providers or vendors know what eligible services your library will need, and you're allowing them at least 28 calendar days to respond with bids. So that's the minimum time period. You can certainly accept bids beyond that, but it's very, very, very important that you don't make any decisions or sign any contract paperwork until at least 28 calendar days have elapsed. Also, if you file a Form 470 to request bids, it does not obligate you to move forward with signing a contract or accepting E-rate funding. So if you go through a bidding process and you're just not satisfied with any of the bids that came in, you don't have to move forward. So in that sense, it's kind of low risk. In addition to having that appropriate time period for bids to come in, you need to ensure that your bidding process is open and fair. So that means you're not giving extra information to one bidder that you're not giving to others. So you're not privileging anyone by giving them, sort of the inside dope that you're not sharing with other vendors that may want to respond. And so all the vendors need to be treated fairly. They're treated the same. You're not giving anybody a heads up about a bidding process. And if you're answering vendor questions, you may be uploading an addendum so all vendors can see the responses at the same time, rather than having a side conversation with a vendor. Also, I do like to remind folks that, we are not haggling. We are not doing a price match down at Walmart. You never should share the information about the amount that another vendor is bidding or the name of that bidder until the process is completely done. So if you're actively in a bidding process, you're not going to let somebody know, like, oh, by the way, this vendor down the road, they can do this a little bit less expensive. Can you match that? That is not what's happening here. All right, when it's time to evaluate the bids, after the minimum required 28 calendar days, you have to make the most cost-effective choice. So that means in the evaluation that the E-rate eligible cost is the primary factor that is most heavily weighted. That doesn't mean that's the only factor, and it doesn't guarantee that the cheapest bid wins. But if USAC were to ask for your bid evaluation paperwork and you hadn't put price as the primary factor, that would be considered a competitive bidding violation and you wouldn't get your funding. Now, especially in Category 2, there are instances where if you have some equipment that has ineligible components, you may also be considering the E-rate ineligible cost of that equipment, but that will be at a lower point value. E-rate eligible highest, then you can have E-rate ineligible. You may have a factor on meeting the technical specifications, prior experience with your library or similar customers, but price is primary. Speaking of vendors, let's talk a little bit about their obligations. So in order for your library to get discounts on a particular vendor's services, they have to be willing to participate in the E-rate program. So if they've never participated before, they're going to need to obtain what's called a Service Provider Identification Number. It's also called a SPIN or Form 498 ID. So that is what uniquely designates them within E-rate and other universal service programs. And this step has started to take a little bit longer because there's now a prerequisite to obtaining Form 498 ID, and that is to have completed SAM.gov registration. So your vendors have to have active SAM.gov registration at the time they're obtaining the SPIN, or it won't be assigned. And the reason that's adding a lot of time to the process is that it takes the FCC systems an entire 4 weeks to recognize that a registration has gone active. So at minimum, it's going to take 5 to 6 weeks for a vendor who doesn't already have the SAM registration to get set up with E-rate. And then any year when a school or library is requesting discounts on a vendor's services, they have to have an annual certification form on file to say, yep, FCC, I'm still going to play along with those E-rate rules. If they don't have the Form 498 or the SPIN, and they don't have the relevant annual certification form on file, you're not going to be able to invoice those discounts. So it's really important that you work with vendors that are willing to play ball. Also, just some notes on what's okay, what's not. It's okay to have some pre-bidding discussions with vendors where you don't talk about prices. They can discuss new technology offerings. They can teach you about new technologies. But if you're going to have pre-bidding meetings, try not to invite just one vendor. You want to invite multiple. Also, you can't have a vendor just give you all the text of what should be requested on a Form 470. You need to be coming up with your own list. So you don't want to copy paste the kind of marketing information about a particular product directly into your form. We can work together on creating those lists that are a little more generic or that emphasize certain specific specifications without sounding like you just copy pasted from what your vendor said about the product. Also, you need to make sure that as the applicant, you don't have a relationship with a vendor that would unfairly influence the outcome of the bid evaluation. You can't give them inside information. You can't have an ownership stake or ownership interest in the company. I think that seems pretty obvious, but we do need to say it. And then, of course, you need to avoid gifts or donations from those service providers. It's just better not to accept anything, even minor swag, so that no one can claim that you were somehow influenced by those gifts. So the best practice when you're dealing with vendors is to always demand the Form 498 ID or SPIN on the bid itself. That's really important. This year, I've also started adding some language about making sure that for the current funding year, the vendor has the annual certification form on file. I don't recommend working with vendors that have never filed an annual certification form, because if they aren't willing to do that step, you're not getting your funding. So they may need to just go ahead and file an annual certification form just to demonstrate that they have the ability and willingness to do it. All right, just a reminder, if you have questions, please feel free to type them in the chat. And now let's talk about requests for proposal. So in E-rate, the term request for proposal, or RFP, is used to describe any additional document that you add to your Form 470 for competitive bidding. So it may be a document that just more thoroughly describes your needs. It may be additional information needed for the process, like a floor plan or blueprints. It could be an addendum you write that has answers to vendors' questions. Just any extra documentation is an RFP. So sometimes these are lengthy and rather formal. So for example, if KDLA had to do a bidding process, we have to go through all of the state rigmarole, and there's just a lot of extra clauses and various attachments that go into that. Your library's document may be much simpler. It's very important that all additional documents are uploaded in the E-rate Productivity Center with the Form 470. You're not allowed just to upload a document that has a link to go to some website to grab it. All of the documents actually have to be in the system. So I really like an RFP document myself. If you've filed with me before, you're going to recognize that I'm a fan of RFPs, because I think it's a great way to have more control on the formatting, to really lay things out logically with sufficient explanation, because there is a narrative field on the Form 470 where you can just type in information, but it's 5,000 characters of plain text. So you can't do bolding, you can't do bullet points, and that may make things look a lot messier to vendors. So I like an RFP document because you can add all the organization you want to it to make sure that your vendor is really understanding what you need. Or if you're like me and you have ADHD, you need bullet points and colors and all the things to keep it straight in your head. No shame in that. Also, I just like the process of putting together an RFP, because it does force you to stop and think a little bit about your needs, what technology you want to procure, what the evaluation factors are. I think it's just that good step to make sure that you're really including everything you need in the bidding process. So an RFP has various elements. This is not exhaustive, but you need a basic description of your library situation. Like, for example, the purpose of this RFP is to get a vendor to perform cabling upgrades in our main branch building, or our library needs to refresh its networking equipment to support new, faster internet. We're upgrading to gigabit this summer. We need equipment that's going to support that. You want to give as detailed as possible a list of your anticipated needs. So that would be the various functions like firewalls, switches, access points, cabling. You can indicate preferences for a particular make and model of equipment as long as you allow bids for equivalent equipment. You can't say, I'm only going to accept bids for this particular brand and anything else will be rejected. By E-rate program rules, you're not allowed to do that. But by expressing a preference and indicating the specifications of that equipment that are most important to you, it does give you a good basis to potentially score vendors lower if they're submitting a supposedly equivalent bid that maybe doesn't really do everything that's needed. You may also want to include information about the evaluation. So what factors might be used in the evaluation? Are there any disqualification factors that you have to keep in mind? We'll talk more about those later. Important dates. Are you offering facility walkthroughs? Is there a vendor question deadline? Is there a hard due date for bids? If you're having a sealed bidding process, then when is the public bid opening? And of course, the contact information. So just a reminder about RFPs. It's fine in an RFP to put a specific due date. It has to align with that minimum required 28 calendar days or be later. Keep in mind though, if in your RFP document or in the narrative field of the Form 470, if you state a date that's after the minimum 28 calendar days, that date you specified is your true allowable contract date. The E-Rate Productivity Center will calculate an allowable contract date. That's just the rote calculation of this is when 28 calendar days will have elapsed. But you may need to keep in mind other information you gave in your RFP. Let's see. And moving along, we also want to consider significant changes. Now, you may be wondering why I have a picture of a cardinal on this page. Great question, viewer. So it used to be that USAC would refer to cardinal changes. They've now changed the language to significant changes, but it just really liked the cardinal background and didn't want to change it. So basically, a significant change is where maybe you upload an addendum to the Form 470 and you're asking for additional things or providing additional information that would, influence how a vendor would respond or whether or not they would respond. So that would be, adding on additional functionality. It would be adding on another location, making a substantial change in the quantity of equipment or cabling you're requesting. So basically, if a vendor might have responded differently knowing that information, that's considered a significant change, and that would restart your 28 calendar day competitive bidding clock. USAC, unfortunately, will not provide a list of everything that constitutes a significant change. When in doubt, you can just let the clock restart on that bidding process, or you can start a brand new one. Please feel free to talk to me before you take that step. All right. In addition to the E-Rate program rules on competitive bidding, you also get to keep in mind state and local bidding rules. Always more layers to this onion. So most Kentucky libraries have adopted the Model Procurement Code, which has been around since 1978. So it spells out certain requirements for various political subdivisions of the Commonwealth of Kentucky, including library districts, any kind of local districts. So that's spelled out in Kentucky Revised Statutes 45A.345 to .460. That is specifically the section of the code for local government. So big thing that you need to keep in mind with this is that if you're going out to bid and it looks like the contract for services may potentially exceed $40,000, you're going to need to go through competitive sealed bidding. So that is where, to make sure that it's a really fair process, you're not opening bids as they come in. You are holding on to them and opening them during a pre-announced public bid opening. Now, for most libraries, sealed bids means that you need to get a physical copy that is mailed or delivered to the library. Most libraries do not have access to kind of an electronic vault system where sealed electronic bids can be submitted. So remember, just emailing a bid is not sealed. It needs to either come in an envelope that's sealed that you don't open to the library, or you need to have a specialized system to take care of that. As part of the sealed bidding process, you need to announce with at least 7 days notice the date, time, and location of the public bid opening. And since the E-Rate documentation is posted online, when you file a Form 470 with the RFP, you're adding your addenda for your bidding process. That's all posted publicly online. So that actually takes care of your public notice requirement, which is really handy. So we've had many libraries do sealed bidding processes. At this point, it's not as common as it used to be because in the past 5-6 years, the threshold where sealed bidding is required has been raised to $40,000. It used to be $20,000. That meant a lot of sealed bidding. So things are a little bit easier now. And I've got lots of examples of those type of bidding processes, and we'll be happy to assist you. And then if your library does not follow the model procurement code, and I need to correct this slide to change the amount to $40,000. That's one of those things that slipped by me. You still have to go through sealed bidding. It's just under a different Kentucky revised statute. That's KRS 424.260, Part 1. So the bidding process has to be advertised in the newspaper of largest circulation in the county. So it's a lot easier to do a sealed bidding process with model procurement rather than doing it under a different statute. And that is why KDLA encourages all libraries to adopt the model procurement code. It's a step that your library board may have taken decades ago. And then I've just got a little bit of boilerplate for a section of the Form 470 where you have a field where you can enter state and local procurement information. So just a simple statement, the library has adopted the Kentucky Model Procurement Code for local government as outlined in Kentucky Revised Statutes 45A.345 to .460. Okay, so now that we've talked a bit about RFPs and some local bidding rules, let's talk about some example RFPs. So I've got 3 examples. Those are available in the course. So from Blackboard, you can download those or I can send them to you directly. We've got internal connections for a cabling project. We've got kind of a sealed bidding process for some networking equipment upgrades. And then we've got a process that is asking for bids that could be for managed services or for basic maintenance services. So I am going to switch over to a screen share real briefly. Let's see. And screen. Okay, and I'll just quickly show these to you. I don't expect you to, take in everything in this example. But here, for instance, let's start with a different one, is an RFP for internal connections with sealed bidding. This example includes the language about sealed bidding that is required. Including, there's a particular due date for the bids. Later on, it talks about the bid opening. And then there's a section for specifications where basically we say, we need all of these things. We're relying on vendors to do a facility walkthrough. Everything that you sell to us needs to be new factory sealed equipment. You don't want anything that is returned, B stock, discontinued equipment. We have a section for the various pieces of networking equipment. In these examples, I have included a mix of different brands, but you do not have to be that specific. You do need to, though, state the functionality at the very least with, an estimated quantity. So in a bidding process for what we call internal connections, your networking equipment and licensing, often when you're doing that bidding process, you may also want to ask about maintenance or technical support subscriptions from the manufacturer. In particular, that would be the case with a firewall. It's less common on things like access points. But that's certainly something to mention as an option because you want to make sure that in this Form 470 process, anything that will ultimately be listed on your Form 471 application was somehow reflected in your bidding process. So it's good to be a bit more expansive in your bidding requests to make sure that you're not caught short when it's time to file that application. Also, we've got some information about formatting of bids and bid evaluations, and then a detailed timeline for walkthroughs, vendor questions, when the bids are due, the public bid opening, and installation. So that's an internal connections example, including sealed bidding. Then we have an example of just a cabling project that is not sealed bidding. It'll be below 40,000. So pretty similar, but we're not setting a firm due date. We just have some basic, we have our bulk cabling and other items that go along with the cabling project, indicating where to install it. And then you'll see down here that in general, if you don't have to state a specific due date, I just like to put in information that this bidding process is going to be open for at least 28 calendar days, but may remain open longer. I generally don't like specifying a due date unless I have to for sealed bidding, because especially during this time of year, you can't be certain that vendors will respond in a timely fashion so you can make your decision on the earliest date possible. Last example, and this is just one example. I have many, many example RFPs that we can update for other processes, but be a situation where you need a vendor to either maintain or manage your equipment. Maybe you're not sure, and so you're asking for proposals for one or both of those options. So in this scenario, we've got a list of equipment that the library owns. And so the vendor is going to need to give a quote for what it would cost to maintain this equipment or for them to manage it on a monthly basis, either or. Sometimes it's good if you're not sure exactly what a vendor might submit to you. So you're kind of covering your bases with both of those. All right, I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to jump back into my files. It will just take me a moment. In the meantime, again, if you have questions, please feel free to type them into the chat. My apologies. I have to scroll down through all my slides to find the one to reselect, and it just takes a sec because there are about 120 slides in this deck, which is a lot. Yeah, I promise I'm getting there eventually. Okay. Just really briefly, the E-Rate Productivity Center is where the Form 470 is filed. So if you need access to the system, you have to have an account. Every library has an account administrator who's responsible for creating and deactivating accounts. However, we know staff changes happen. So if you're in a situation where the staff member that used to be the admin has left and you can't log in as that person to create an account for yourself, we have to work with customer service for them to manually add you to the system. Also, I've got two links to get to the system. There is a direct link to the E-Rate Productivity Center, or most often I direct people to the main USAC website, and there's a convenient sign-in button at the top of the page. All right, so for this Form 470 process, I'm going to talk about some very general things to keep in mind and talk about the layout of the slides for later reference, and then we'll go into an actual example of filing it live using a training portal. So I just want to point out, in case you're not familiar with the layout of the E-Rate Productivity Center, you've got a link on the main page in the group to the upper right to start a new form. From your big blue menu bar at the top, you can reopen a form that's in process. Maybe you stop for a bit and need to go back to it. There's an alternate way to start it from your profile. So, but for the most part, we're having people go to that link at the upper right of the page. And then here I have some notes on navigation about going back or continuing through the form, discarding a form if needed. And just keep in mind, the save and share button is generally not a good idea because that takes it off your tasks list and sends it to other users on behalf of your library system. And it's just a way to lose track of your form. So I call that the devil button, and I just tell you not to use it. Okay. So, and we'll go over this again in the live screen sharing portion. When you start a new form, first page just has some basic information about your library pulled from the profile in the system, and you can enter a nickname for your form. The next page just has more information about your library system, including the number of branches if you have multiple branches, and the system build entity number that files on behalf of all the branches in the system. Since this is pulled from profile information, you can't actually make any edits on this page. You indicate a contact person, which needs to be somebody in the system, in your library system that has an account for the E-Rate Productivity Center. We've got a section for indicating the category, uploading RFP documents, and then we've got some general navigation information about adding service requests. So I'm going to kind of skip past this because I want to get to a section to show you about some of the examples that are in these slides. Skipping ahead here. And these are all available for reference later. So the service requests, they're split into examples for internal connections, basic maintenance, and managed services. I do want to note that there are different colors for the titles of the slides so that you know you're in the right section. So kind of reddish for internal connections, there's blue for basic maintenance, and then there's purple for managed services. And so I will be giving some examples that are similar to what's in the slides, but it's not going to exactly reflect what's in the slides. And if you have a particular type of equipment that you want to have information about requesting, you're welcome to put that in the chat and I will do that specific example. Okay, so now we want to go back to another screen share, which will take just a moment. All right, and then I'm going to switch over to the training portal for the E-Rate Productivity Center. So this training portal mirrors what you see in the live system. I have a fake library system set up for this. So good old Pioneer County Public Library is going to be filing a Form 470 for some Category 2 requests. At the upper right corner of the page in the group of links, I'll click on FCC Form 470 to start a new form. First page, and it loads. You can see it indicates that it's funding year 2025, the Form 470. It has information about the library system, again, pulled from profiles. If this information is inaccurate at this time, you're going to have to leave it this way because you can't currently make those edits while the application window is open. You may need to put notes in the narrative field or RFP document about the correct street address as an example. And then during application review, you can ask a reviewer to edit this information for you. All right, for the nickname, this is your choice. I generally like to have something like funding year 2025 to 2026 to indicate the time period, Category 2, whatever you would like, and then save and continue. The next page, again, just has information about the library system pulled from the profiles. In this example, this system has 3 branches, which includes a main branch, a bookmobile, and then another branch library. And then this is the system build entity number that handles the filing on behalf of all of the entities within the system. Save and continue. Right, next up, we have a page with contact information. There's only one library at this point that has a consultant that files on their behalf. And since that consultant does handle the form filing, the library would never be on this page to see it. So for most of you, there's not going to be anything listed as a consulting firm, where you're paying somebody else to handle your filing. You'll skip down to contact information. Generally, you'll say, yes, you are the main contact person generally the person filling out the form is the person who's going to be dealing with the vendors accepting the bids. Otherwise, you can indicate no, and you can search for another user in the E-Rate Productivity Center that's associated with your library system. All right, then on to categories of service. On the Form 470, you can actually include both Category 1 and Category 2 requests if needed. However, today we're just going to click on the Category 2 button so it turns blue, and then we'll save and continue. The page after that asks if you have any RFPs for the services being requested. If you answer yes, then you'll get an upload field toward the right. If you have multiple RFP documents, you're going to need to upload them one at a time. I also want to emphasize that this system is rather picky about the file names. It won't accept documents that have a hyphen or parentheses in the file name. Underscores are fine, but not hyphens, not parentheses. You can upload Word documents, PDFs, Excel files. I think you can even do picture files if needed. So I'm going to click on Upload, and I'm in a folder that has my presentation documents. So one at a time, I'm just going to grab the 3 different RFP examples that I brought up earlier. Okay. So I have each of those uploaded. If I made a mistake and uploaded the wrong document, I just hover over the little file icon and there's an X I can click on. Right, then I'm ready to save and continue. The next page still concerns RFPs. It's asking if any of these RFP documents apply to all of the service requests under Category 2. In this case, we're going to be doing examples from a little bit of each RFP. So there's not one RFP that we want to automatically link to everything. For most libraries, though, if you've got a Category 2 bidding project that's going to involve lots of pieces of equipment, it may be advantageous to check a box here so that you're not having to remember to check off that RFP on each individual service request you make. Save and continue. Now we are on the page for service requests under Category 2. So to get started, we're going to click on the blue Add New Service Request button. And we'll start with some examples from the Internal Connections document, or RFP. So when you start a new service request, you get a set of 3 I-Seek bid statements. For internal connections, you'll choose the first statement that says, I seek bids for the equipment needed for broadband connectivity within schools and libraries, and/or the related software and right-to-use licenses necessary for the equipment to function. Once I make that selection, it tells me that the service type is, in fact, internal connections, which is what I want. And then you have a drop-down for function. So this is where you're indicating more specifically the type of internal connections equipment you want. So for this example, I'm going to do an access point. So I open this function drop-down, and you'll see there are a lot of different choices. I'm going to go down to the second to last option, wireless access points and necessary software and licenses. So in a situation where you've got the hardware for the access point and a license to give you permission to use it, this one service request with the function wireless access points and necessary software and licenses will cover both of those things. So for the quantity, in this case, I'm asking for 3 access points. The manufacturer, and this is just an example, not an endorsement, a number of Kentucky libraries have Meraki access points. So we'll indicate Meraki or equivalent. The or equivalent is there because you can't just say, I'm only going to accept bids for Meraki equipment. You have to allow vendors to submit bids for alternate brands of the same functionality. For installation activation, in this particular example, I'm going to say no. I'm going to install the equipment myself. I don't need somebody to come do that. And then I'm going to come down here and check off the Category 2 RFP for internal connections. And this is part of the sealed bidding process. Now, I know for Meraki Access Points, I don't need a basic maintenance subscription because the maintenance is built into the right to use license. However, if you want to be on the safe side, I generally recommend that for a request for internal connections, you go ahead and tack on a request for basic maintenance in case you get a bid for equivalent equipment that may need that maintenance subscription to keep it operating optimally. So in this case, there's an option here at the lower left. I'm going to check this option that says, please select this option if you would like to create an accompanying Category 2 basic maintenance request for this internal connections request. So I check that and scroll down, and you'll see that it's created another service type for basic maintenance. It's got the same function, it's got the same quantity, it's got the same manufacturer. And for various convoluted reasons, basic maintenance requests ask about the number of entities served, even though most internal connections requests don't. To me, that's just not consistent, but that's E-rate for you. So the number of entities served, I'm going to say 1 because all of these access points are going into my main branch. And I will again check the RFP document for internal connections and save request. So that is just one example. Let's see something else on here. If you wanted to add a firewall request, you would again choose the first iSeek bid statement to get internal connections, and then you would choose firewall service, components, and necessary software and licenses as your function. The quantity will be 1 for the main branch, and I highly recommend anytime you ask for a firewall under internal connections, you need to add basic maintenance because it's very common for that piece of equipment to really need that maintenance and technical support subscription to keep everything up to date. So I'm going to go ahead and check that. This time, I'm just going to say no preference on the manufacturer. So if you don't know what you want or don't care, you can leave it as no preference. I do want to point out that you also have an option to choose other. So if you look through, if you have a preference and you look through this list and you're like, I don't see the one that I want, it doesn't match the brand name that I know of, you can type in other, and then you could type in a description like Arista. And then again, I'm not asking for installation, I'm going to do it myself. I'm going to check the option for that internal connections RFP document. I'll also do that down here. And of course, one entity served. Okay, now I'm going to switch over to the RFP for cabling. Because cabling is kind of it's a little bit different than some of the other requests, so that's why I wanted to include some examples, because it's a little bit different than the networking equipment. So let's say I'm doing my project where I want somebody to come in and put in a bunch of new cabling and all of the various connectors and doodads that go along with that cabling project, such as the materials for cable drops, like surface mount boxes, cable raceways. Maybe I need a patch panel in my IT closet. Maybe I need patch cables, all of those things. So I'm going to add new service request, and I will again choose the first iSeek bid statement because cabling is under internal connections. And this time the function will just be cabling. I do want to point out though that the quantity is a bit different here, because the unit for this quantity, instead of just being each, is actually labeled feet. So they are asking about the linear feet of cabling that you estimate you need for this particular project. So in this case, I'm going to put 15,000. Maybe this is a big building, I'm redoing all of the cabling. If I want the person installing the cabling to agree to maintain it over the first year to make sure there aren't any issues, I might check this box. I may indicate a preference. For example, I may want some cabling from Belkin. So I would choose Belkin or equivalent as my manufacturer. On internal connections requests for cabling, they do ask the number of entities served, which would be 1. In this case, I do need a vendor to come install this for me. And I will check off the RFP for the cabling project. I will also go down and do that in the secondary request that was made for basic maintenance of that cabling. You don't necessarily need that, but if you've got a huge cabling project, that may be something you want. Then when you're done, you're going to save request. Do need to point out that there is a button for save and create another request. However, that makes another service request of the exact same service type and function. And when you use that save and create another request button, you can't edit what the function is. So it's pretty rare for a library to need to make 2 service requests for the same service type and functionality in a row. So most of the time you're going to be choosing save request. All right, and then I may have some additional things I need along with my cabling project. So for example, I've got on the list a rack enclosure. So that will also be internal connections. This time I will choose the function racks. Need 1 of them. I don't need basic maintenance on a rack. This might be the manufacturer, Great Lakes or equivalent. I do need somebody to install it, and this is part of my cabling project. One more example for the cabling project might be if you know some particular cabling related components that you need. So as an example, I'll add a new service request, again for internal connections, this time the function. I'm going to choose the sort of catch-all category, which is, or catch-all function I should say, which is antennas, connectors, and related components. In this case, I want a patch panel. I want quantity 1 patch panel. This is going to be for the manufacturer Panduit. For 1 entity, I do need that installed. So that might be useful if you have some really specific requests as far as the manufacturer for those items. However, it's possible that if you just have a request for a bulk amount of cabling, that would still cover a lot of the additional components like the service mount boxes, the patch panels, the patch cables. There are different schools of thought. If you've got some real specific extra components you need that go with the cabling project, I recommend adding the service requests for antennas, connectors, and related components. It's just kind of depends. So I'm glad to help you if you're trying to determine whether you need some of these extra service requests. Okay, last example. We have that RFP, which I will bring up now. So this was the RFP for basic maintenance or managed internal broadband services. We've already seen several basic maintenance requests, so we're not going to, we'll do one example to show how you start one of those fresh, and then we'll do some managed services examples. So I will again, got this growing grid of requests that I've made. If I need to edit anything that I've already worked on, I can check the box to the left, and then I can choose edit service request or remove service request as needed to make edits, or if I need to just totally take something off that I added mistakenly, I can do that. We're going to add new service request. I'm going to do the first thing listed on the list of equipment that needs to be maintained or monitored. So first off, I'm going to add a request that would be for maintenance of the equipment. So I'm going to choose the second statement. I seek bids for basic maintenance service on eligible equipment and/or support services, e.g. bug fixes, software upgrades, and security patches appropriate to maintain reliable equipment. Once I select that, it comes up with the service type basic maintenance of internal connections. For the function dropdown, I'm going to choose switch. So this is a switch I already own. I have quantity 1 of them. And then for the manufacturer preference, I'm going to choose Netgear. Now you'll notice on this list that it doesn't say or equivalent. When you're making basic maintenance requests fresh, there's an assumption that this is either a piece of equipment you already own or that you're buying that funding year. And that's why you can be more specific with the manufacturer, and that or equivalent isn't required. Number of entities served, we're still doing the main branch. And then I will check off my RFP for basic maintenance or managed internal broadband services. Save request. Okay, so I may go through, I would need to cover all the basic maintenance functions for the various types of equipment that may need to be maintained. Once I've completed that list, I can move on to managed services. And this differs just a little bit in the logic built into adding the service request. It's just one extra step. So I'm going to click on Add New Service Request. And at last, I will choose the third statement. I seek bids for the operation, management, and monitoring of eligible broadband internal connections. Once I make that selection, I get another set of I seek bid statements. For managed services, you have an option to seek bids for managed services for equipment that I currently lease or will lease. So again, that's an option where the equipment is owned by the vendor and they install it in your library, and they're responsible for the licensing and making sure it's operational, but your library doesn't own that outright. The other option is I seek bids for managed services or MIBs using equipment that I currently own or will own. So that would be a situation where you have existing equipment you're still going to be using and you just need somebody to manage it, or you are seeking some new equipment that the library will own outright, and then you need somebody to manage it. Now, for some libraries, they know the answer of which of these options makes the most sense. If you are not sure, I actually recommend making 2 different requests. For this first example, I'm going to choose the statement that it's for equipment that I currently own or will own. That kind of matches the RFP document. So it comes down with the service type, managed internal broadband services, and the function is already selected for me, existing equipment. I then need to state the number of entities served, which will again be 1, and I'm going to check off my RFP for basic maintenance or managed services and save request. But let's say I'm seeking managed services, but it's for equipment that may be leased. Choose the third I seek a bid statement, and then choose the statement about I seek bids for MIBs using equipment that I currently lease or will lease. So again, that comes out with the right service type and the function of leased equipment. I indicate the number of entities served. I'm going to check the appropriate RFP. And for managed services, you really do either need to have an RFP document or a narrative, because otherwise this request is so generic. It's so vague. Your vendor wouldn't have any idea of what you really needed if you didn't provide a good description of the types of functionality involved, what types of equipment you currently have, or what you're looking to lease. And save request. All right, so those are just a few examples of various service requests. I've got a grid of over 10 of them. So we're just going to pretend that I covered every single thing that was listed in all of the RFP documents. That would have taken a while if I'd done all of those. So I do still have the narrative field below. I might just say something like, please see the RFP documents for all details. Or if I were requesting something that's a lot simpler and I didn't need an RFP document, I might be pasting a narrative here. There's an example in the slides of an example narrative for a wireless access point request. That's pretty simple. Save and continue. Next up, I have to answer a question about technical contact person. Most of the time, if you're already the main contact on the form and you're the only person involved in the process, I would recommend just saying no, because it's repetitive to list yourself again. But if you have another staff member who's more knowledgeable on tech and will be assisting you with the process, and you really want the questions to go directly to them, you can say yes. But my preference is saying no. However, if you do say yes, you can either search for another staff member who has an E-Rate Productivity Center account, or you can actually enter the details manually and type in their name, title, phone number, and email. I'm just going to switch it to no, though, because I prefer to have all of the questions and all of the bidding information go to one person. And then if you need to work with another staff member in your library, you can just turn around and ask them. But I really like to keep it down to one singular contact, if at all possible. I'll save and continue. Then I get to state or local procurement requirements, and I will answer yes here. And I will say Pioneer County Public Library has adopted the Kentucky Model Procurement Code for local governments as outlined in KRS 45A.345-.460. I am doing that from memory, so I'm just hoping that's correct. I'm pretty sure I am, though. Once I've answered the state or local procurement requirements, I then have an option to review FCC Form 470. So I'll click on that button, and then my form goes away for a while. So the system is going to take about 30 seconds to generate a draft PDF copy of the Form 470, so I can kind of see what the final version will look like. So the draft copy is not something that you need to print or save permanently for your records. As it's a draft, it's not useful for retention. What it is useful for, though, is sending a copy to your state E-Rate coordinator for her to review before you put that out in the wider world. So if you do want me to review a 470, make sure to send me the draft 470 document. It's a PDF. And if there are any RFP documents, I need those too. So it's been about 30 seconds. So now I'm going to go check my tasks list to see if it's ready. So I've got a couple things on my tasks list because I also was messing around with an application form earlier. But this first link at the top, to reopen the form, I'll click on Certify FCC Form 470. It has the form number and the nickname. Now we'll open on a page for download document link. So again, this is to download the draft copy. You can see at the end of the link and at the end of the file name, it says that it's a draft. So I'll just save this locally here, and then I'm going to open it and take a quick look. I can zoom in a bit. So it will show all sections that are completed. Got my contact information, the profile information. For sections where I didn't have a response, there are blanks. So it still has a section that says consulting firms, but I didn't have responses for that. I then have a list of all of my RFP documents. Note that there are IDs assigned. So when you're looking at the grid of service requests, you can tell which RFP document is linked with which service request. Category 1 service request section is blank because I didn't have anything. I didn't request any Category 1 in this particular form. So I will skip to Category 2 service requests. And you can see I've got a long list of various requests for internal connections, basic maintenance, or if I go down here, managed internal broadband services. One common question I get is, why do I have the number of entities listed on some of these requests but not others? And that's just based on what the system gives you fields for. So it's okay if some of these internal connections requests don't have the number of entities listed. You haven't done anything wrong. That just wasn't a field you could respond to. Okay, and then if I chose other for a manufacturer, one that wasn't on the predetermined list, if I type something in, an ID will be assigned to that. So for example, we've got this manufacturer other description. So I can see here that this internal connections request is linked to number 1. I go down to this list and I see that the manufacturer is Arista. Got my narrative. I chose not to list a technical contact. I have my state or local procurement requirements, my build entity number at the end. So in this case, I'm going to say I'm satisfied with this. And once I've decided that the information in that draft copy is correct, we'll check this option that says, by checking this box, I certify that the information in the PDF document above is correct. I will then have a blue button to continue to certification. Overwhelmingly, 99.9% of the time, the person who is working on creating this Form 470 will also be the certifier. There is an option where you can send it to another staff member, like a director, to do the certification. But again, I think more cooks in the kitchen, more opportunities for mistakes or losing track of forms. So we're going to continue to certification. On the pop-up, I'm answering yes to proceed to the certification section. Then on the last page, to certify FCC Form 470, there are, I believe, 6 or 7 statements that I need to check off, 6 or 7 certifications. I'm indicating that the library is eligible to participate in the E-rate program as determined by the state library agency, KDLA. That you're going to allow the 28 minimum calendar day competitive bidding period. You're going to retain documents for at least 10 years after the last date for service in the funding year. You're following all competitive bidding rules, so not just E-rate rules, but also any local, state, federal rules. And that basically you are not a criminal who's been barred from participating in E-rate, and you're not going to work with people who are. The discounts are really going to be used on equipment that's used for an educational purpose. Basically, everything the library does is an educational purpose, so no worries there. And then you're also indicating that you understand that you need to separately budget for other technology needed to make effective use of the equipment or the internet access you're getting E-rate discounts on. So that would be stuff like computers, software, training, those kind of things. Once they're all checked, the lower right, you can click on the blue Certify button. On the last pop-up, you're indicating that you understand that making a false statement on this form may result in civil liability or criminal prosecution. You're also indicating that you were authorized to make certifications on this form on behalf of the entity, meaning the library. So answer yes. Okay. And then your form just disappears, but fear not, the system has it. We'll click on this USAC logo to return to the landing page, the main page we started on. When we scroll to the bottom of the page, there's a section for looking up FCC forms. It's already set to look up the Form 470. I do need to select funding year 2025. Now, I have a whole bunch of forms I've filed because I've done so many examples. So I'm just going to rearrange this so the new one is at the top. So when you find the form, click on the nickname, and that will take you to the individual record for that Form 470 in the system. If you look on this Summary tab, do you want to point out that it shows the allowable contract date? So if I filed a 470 today to open a competitive bidding process, the 28 calendar days will have elapsed by Valentine's Day, February 14th. On the allowable contract date, you'll receive an automated email from USAC to let you know that the earliest possible allowable contract date has arrived. For now, what I want to do is switch from the Summary tab over to Generated Documents. And the original version link is the certified copy of the Form 470 that I want to save for my records. Note that it does say certified in the file name. So this very much looks like the draft that we looked at earlier, but when you scroll to the bottom, you're going to see all of those certifications that you selected, and you'll also see your contact information as the authorized person who certified the form. So now let's stop this screen share. Let me try to jump back in my files, which will take me a minute because I do have to scroll through quite a few more to get back into the form. And we'll just do a little bit of wrapping up. Oh boy, this is what I get for putting so many slides together. Okay, still working, still hanging in there. If you've got any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat. Okay, draft copy, proceed. Still working to get there. To copy. Okay, let's talk about allowable contract date a little bit more. Okay. So again, the allowable contract date for your form is listed in the record, and you will receive, the automated email for that, keeping in mind that your true allowable contract date may be later if you specified a later due date in your RFP documents or in your narrative field. So once you reach the automatically calculated 28 calendar day bidding period, you reach the end of that, you'll receive an automated email from USAC to let you know that that earliest possible allowable contract date has arrived, and it will have a PDF attachment for bid evaluations. So again, it's really, really, really important that you don't make any decisions, and you definitely don't sign any contract paperwork before you've reached that allowable contract date. If you don't receive all the bids you care to consider, you can continue accepting later than that. Do not do shorter. That is the biggest, baddest no-no you can make in E-rate. So that's the one thing, do not mess that up. And if you don't receive any proposals, we can certainly reach out to vendors to find more to respond. So again, for bid evaluations, cost must be the primary factor. You may receive some bids that are spam or generic. So sometimes you'll get bids that are actually not relevant because they're not even for the right type of service. So those are just generic. You don't have to respond to them. You may also, if you stated disqualification factors in your RFP or narrative information, for example, you're going to reject bids from vendors that don't have a spin, or from vendors that haven't filed the annual certification form. If you've got those kind of yes, no sort of binary statements for disqualification factors, you can disqualify bids. You just want to be really careful and make sure that you've looked through the entire proposal to make sure that whatever was required that was missing is actually missing. You can also consider some state contracts as bids. I don't think many Kentucky libraries really do that, but that is an option. This is the example evaluation matrix that USAC provides. This is just one example, again, with the E-rate eligible cost as the primary factor, but that doesn't mean you have to use these exact factors in your bid evaluation. Also, you may need to keep in mind the eligibility of the products that you're purchasing, because some of them may have security features that aren't eligible. So you may need to search E-rate and the manufacturer name. A lot of them have web pages where you can search by the SKU for the product, or they've got just a list you can search through to find that information. This is one of my pet topics that I'm really good at, so please feel free to reach out to me if you need help determining, what the actual eligible costs or pieces of equipment are. Don't forget, retain your documents for a super long time. Document retention is 10 years after the last date for service in the funding year. Keep all the forms, RFPs, bids received, winning and losing, your bid evaluation, contracts if you sign them, and invoices for service until sometime, probably September 30th of 2036 in this case. Just to wrap up, you will need to, after you've completed your competitive bidding process, file the Form 471 application for discounts. That form is due on March 26th. If you do need a contract or legally binding agreement for particular services, that contract must be fully executed, generally with a library representative signature and an authorized person from the vendor before you file the Form 471. Don't jump the gun. I've got links to various resources. And I did want to add in particular that USAC has come out with some really good resources this year that are updated. They have a guiding statements table that talks more about the various functionalities and all those ISEEK bid statements. They also have a really nice e-learning module, how to file an FCC Form 470. And you may get more out of that than watching this presentation with me. I'm not going to be offended. I'm just glad that there are other good tools out there for you. I think at this point, most people watching this webinar are already on Kentucky Tech. We do want to say a quick thank you to the Institute of Museum and Library Services, because their funding makes E-rate training and other technology training possible. So thank you for your support, IMLS. And there's my contact information on the last slide, lauren.abner@ky.gov, or you can call me at 502-564-1728. If you're looking at the PDF slides, there's also a link to my bookings page. You can request an appointment directly through the bookings page. So thank you very much for your time, and good luck with all of your bidding processes. Thank you.